This episode includes descriptions of gun violence and suicide. Please take care when listening.
While you were on the call at Storm Mountain, we responded East Patrol on a suspicious in Parley's Canyon by Little Dell. Currently, he's got 2 gunshot victims there, if you want to head up there now.
Keith Stevens was a homicide detective on duty for the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office when this call came in. It was around 10:20 p.m., August 28, 1996. He was driving his unmarked patrol car along a road that snakes across the base of the Wasatch Mountains. To the west were the lights of the Salt Lake Valley, a community laid out in an orderly grid system. To the east loomed the wild of the Wasatch, with canyon scenes illuminated only by the light of a full moon. It was about a 10-minute drive to Little Dell Reservoir. As he arrived, he saw in his headlights a grim scene. Paramedics were working on a badly injured young woman, 18-year-old Yvette Rodier. He parked on the shoulder of the road and got out of his car. He heard Yvette telling rescue workers that her friend had been shot down the hill, closer to the water. Detective Stevens made his way past the frantic scene, through the dirt parking lot, and down the paved path, where he found the lifeless body of Zachary Snar.
Go down and find an individual that is deceased, blood-covered, with a lot of personal items around, a camera, tripod, blanket.
If you copy me, we do have 1 echo up here.
Echo. That's the police code for a fatality.
He was already in the throes of being dead for a little while. So he's very cold, very stiff.
Keith called for the medical examiner while paramedics loaded Yvette into a helicopter. Police attention shifted to the suspect. Their first clues were a missing Bronco and an abandoned white truck.
At this time, it appears that the victim's vehicle was taken by the suspect. They don't know who he is. It's a Bronco, and that's as much as I've got right now.
We knew that Zachary's vehicle was gone and there was a vehicle left there. There was a vehicle registration there that provided us with a name, address. So immediately people were dispatched from the scene without having any real information other than we have 2 people that have been shot. So it's inherent that you better be careful when you're starting to follow up this information. The individual's obviously armed and dangerous.
From KSL Podcasts, I'm Amy Donaldson, and this is The Letter. Episode 3, A Gun and a Death Wish. When police checked the registration of the pickup truck that was abandoned in the Little Dell parking lot, they learned it belonged to a 19-year-old man named Jorge Benvenuto. By 2:20 a.m., Detective Bob Bobrowski was talking to his older sister, Monica, in her apartment on the west side of Salt Lake City.
Monica, what I'd like to do is kind of go over a few events with you, and maybe you can kind of help us out and see what's going on. Tell me what's up with your brother.
Well, Monica began by telling police her brother had been staying with her for the last week. She said he planned to move out of state in the next few days, and that he'd recently purchased a gun. Earlier that night, she returned home to find her building manager and police trying to enter her apartment after reports of a gunshot from inside. She showed detectives a bullet hole in the wall above her sink. Her brother, however, was gone. She had no idea what happened. But buying that handgun, she told them, had prompted new and concerning comments from her brother.
It was mainly after he got the gun that he's been talking about killing somebody and,
Why?
just for no reason.
Killing who?
Anybody.
Is he angry at something right now?
Why would a 19-year-old with no criminal history shoot two people he didn't know? The answer would prove to be elusive for everyone involved, even those who knew and loved Jorge Benvenuto. Monica tried to explain to a TV reporter that her brother's decision to buy a gun was prompted by a theft.
Monica Benvenuto says her brother talked about shooting the people who broke into his apartment a few weeks ago.
I told them it's not worth it. She's spending the rest of your life in prison for somebody that took some stuff.
But then she says Jorge Benvenuto said it didn't matter who he shot. He just wanted to know what it would feel like.
Overnight, this became the story. A man who just wanted to see what it felt like to kill someone, anyone. Journalists quickly labeled it a thrill kill. As police chased every lead in those first few hours, a narrative took shape, and it would shock everyone involved. Months after the shooting, Detective Stevens talked with some of those who knew Jorge, but they could only provide pieces of why he shot two strangers.
Okay, I want to talk to you a little bit about an acquaintance you had towards the end of summer, middle of summer, an individual named Jorge Benvenuto. Do you recognize the name? Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
Tom Watson lived in the same apartment complex where Jorge lived earlier that summer.
How did you first become acquainted with Mr. Benvenuto?
Tom said he and his wife only really got to know Jorge after his apartment had been burglarized in that last week of July.
And he asked us if we had seen anybody that looked suspicious that may have broken into his apartment. He said his apartment had been broken into that night. And we told him no. And about an hour later, he came back up to our apartment and was telling us what all supposedly had been stolen.
Did you at a time then begin, for lack of a better term, a friendly relationship with Mr. Benvenuto?
I would say so, yes.
Okay. Describe that for me.
He started coming up to our house. We thought it was kind of weird because he never brought a friend or anything with him, but he would sit for 3 or 4 or 5 hours at a time, and he didn't have friends of his own. My wife even asked him if he had a girlfriend, and he said, well, he had one in New York, but he didn't have one here.
Jorge had only moved to Utah from New York in the fall of 1995. For about 9 months, he lived with his brother Pablo in Provo. But once Pablo got married, Jorge moved in with his sister in Salt Lake City. When Monica moved to a new place in mid-July, her brother stayed in the apartment they'd shared for a few weeks after she left. That's when he befriended Tom.
But he came to our house quite regular. I would say 3 to 4 times a week. This was in a period of a month. And he got to know us pretty well.
During these visits to your home, did he describe how he felt about having someone break into his apartment?
Yes, he said he was very angry. He thought that the man that lived all the way to the end of the hall from where he lived on the left-hand side, he thought that he had broken into his house. And he said if he had had the gun that he ordered at that time, he said, I'd go down there and shoot him. And he seemed very disturbed.
Monica said her brother was very upset by the break-in, and his response was centered on buying a gun.
Somebody broke into the apartment and stole a lot of his stuff. A couple of times this happened. Somebody broke in and took all his tools, and he had the TV. All this stuff is his. So he was really upset about that. That's when he got the gun.
At just 19 years old, Jorge was too young to legally buy a gun for himself. But police learned from Monica that he got some help. He had befriended an older co-worker at the car dealership where he worked. His name was Evan Smith, and he already owned a pistol and a revolver. That summer, Evan told police he took Jorge shooting with him in the desert west of Salt Lake City.
So we went out to some
public land out south of the West Desert. And just went and shot some bottles and cans or whatever was out there. People take out microwaves, barrels and things to shoot at. So we did that weekend. And
do you remember approximately when that was?
It's close to the end of July.
Evan said George had an idea about the kind of gun that he wanted for himself.
He had mentioned that he was looking at some pistols and how he liked 44. And I thought it was just he'd been watching too many Dirty Harry movies or something.
Uh-huh.
You know, he liked it because it was big, it was loud, and it had a big bullet.
The next weekend, they went together to a retail shop where you could try out guns in the basement. They chose the kind of revolver that George was interested in and shot 50 rounds.
And he just fell in love with it right there.
On that trip, George decided he wanted a Colt Anaconda 44 Magnum with a 6-inch barrel, but since he was under 21, he needed help acquiring it.
So we talked about it for a while, and he finally convinced me to buy the gun for him.
Evan said he put the gun on layaway, but George made the payments. Unlike other forms of credit, layaway doesn't allow a person to take possession of the items until it's completely paid off. Evan said George paid the $450 owed in just a couple of weeks. The informal agreement was that they'd share the gun.
And I don't know if, I was just the gullible one, the one person that he found that would actually do it for him or what, but, I guess at the time it seemed like an okay thing to do. Now that I think about it, it's pretty stupid.
Evan said George seemed pretty responsible when they went out shooting together. He tried to teach him some gun safety.
Didn't seem like he'd ever shot a gun before.
They picked up the gun on a Saturday and immediately took it out target shooting.
Would there be a location out there or a specific item that you shot that if we went out there we could recover a slug? Do you think that would be possible?
Actually, believe it or not, I have a stump of wood in my garage that has a slug from that particular pistol in it.
Evan explained that they were testing the power of the Magnum with the Hydroshock bullets. That's a type of ammunition commonly used in self-defense because it's designed for deeper penetration and expansion when fired. In other words, Hydroshock bullets were popular because they neutralized any threat. They found a lean-to structure, and George tried to shoot a piece of wood off of it.
We got a piece of it off, and in the piece of it that we got off was one of the slugs.
Evan said they threw the piece of wood in the back of the truck and took it home because George wanted to show it to people.
You ever express while you were out there blowing things up that he wanted to see what it would be like to shoot someone, a human being? Did that ever come up? Or, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but similar to, I wonder what this would do? Or...
Evan remembered a moment when George attempted to fire the gun at a rock at close range, something he felt was reckless.
I turned around and there he is, 2 feet away from this rock, pulling the trigger, and I went, because I thought it was going to, kill him. Well, it didn't do anything, and it pretty much shattered the rock, and he came back and says, wow, that was cool. And I says, man, that was stupid. Going shooting a rock like that, you don't know if it's going to ricochet or a piece of rock's going to come up and hit you. He said, if I do that to a rock, I wonder what it'd do to his human.
Evan can't quite remember exactly what he said in response to this question. But Keith asks, you're pretty sure you had that conversation? And Evan confirms.
Well, yeah, he said kind of that, I wonder what this would do to a person. And I says, well, I don't know, why don't you go shoot a rabbit and find out or something like that, I honestly never really thought he would use it to shoot a person.
No, yeah. I didn't think
he was the type of person to do that. Maybe that's a serious character misjudgment on my part.
One of the first people George showed the gun to was his neighbor, Tom Watson. Tom remembered George bringing it to his apartment the same day he first took it target shooting.
It was fully loaded. At the time, we didn't know it was loaded. And he was playing with it, spinning the chamber. It was just like he was obsessed with it. He couldn't keep his hands off of it.
Where did he keep the gun?
In his waistband of his pants. He carried it with him religiously.
Did you have a conversation or speak to him the week of this incident, the August 28th incident, where we're investigating him for the shooting of the two kids up the canyon?
Yes, Monday, the 26th of August, he came to our apartment. He was there approximately 2 hours. And during that time, he told us, he patted his side and he said, he said, I'm going to have to take this gun and I'm going to have to go out and shoot somebody. He says, I really want to see what it'll do to them. And he said, shooting targets is not fun anymore. And this was on a Monday.
Okay. When he was talking about that, did you have any realization that he was serious about what he was talking about?
We thought it was all a joke. We just told him, we said, yeah, go out and shoot somebody and you spend the rest of your life in jail. And he says, oh, I'm not worried about that. They'd never take me alive anyway.
That was the last time that Tom saw George in person. After the break, George disappears with the gun. George's co-worker, Evan, said that the weekend of target shooting would be the last time they would spend together. George had been talking about moving to Las Vegas, so Evan wasn't surprised when George came in the Monday before the shooting and quit his job. He said he'd be leaving by the end of the week, but the next morning, Evan said George was fired.
I came back to the main counter and his stuff was gone and he was gone. And I guess it was destruction of property. They found out he had broken or destroyed some property, and I guess it was the final straw or something.
Evan didn't know exactly why George was fired. He told police in an interview that George occasionally did irresponsible things, like driving the dealership cars too fast, but overall, he seemed like a good worker.
And we valued him as an employee because he was quick, he was a hard worker, and he was smart. He knew how to get things done. He seemed to know how the parts went really well right off the bat. We're kind of sorry to see him go.
Did he seem to be mentally ill, in your opinion, at all? I mean, was he functional? Was he literate? Did he express normal ideals?
Well, it's hard to say. I've met a lot of people like George at his age, and I was a little bit like George at his age, not to the extremes that he went to, but a lot of similarities.
George told Evan that his parents had problems and had been through a divorce. George confided that he wasn't getting along well with his sister, but Evan admitted he didn't really know the details.
I never knew the full story on anything, I really didn't ask. I thought that was personal information,
But there was nothing that really alarmed you?
Nothing that really stood out to me. No red flags, just kind of the average guy,
Anything else you can think of about your relationship with George that I haven't asked you?
Well, the last week or so there before he left, he seemed to be finalizing everything. He closed his bank account. He closed out his apartment.
Evan said George began selling or giving away all of his things.
He was selling all his stuff, gave everything that he had to his sister, and tried to sell his truck.
Did he ever express to you an ideation to kill himself? Suicide?
No, it never seemed like he was suicidal. I mean, he showed some of the traits, like get rid of everything you have.
That was only during that 1 week time span?
only during that 1 week.
Okay. Did he seem to be depressed a lot?
He seemed to be angry a lot. It's kind of worried me because I just got him a gun, and then all of a sudden he's angry all the time.
What was he angry about?
He never really said.
You just felt that there was some type
of... He just kind of had a different personality. And, it kind of worried me for a while there because, not only because now he was armed, but because he was leaving, and he kind of had it set in his mind that he was gone. And he was going to burn all his bridges to the ground before he left.
Tom and his wife were in bed watching the news the night of August 28, 1996. The phone rang, but they let their answering machine pick it up. Then they heard George's voice.
We picked up on the call because he said it was very important that he had done something
so
bad.
So you're in your house, the telephone rings, you just let the machine pick it up, and you can hear the caller's voice on the other end of the phone asking you to pick up the phone?
Yes, and my wife picked up the phone.
But once George started talking, she handed the phone to Tom.
Tom, he said, I've really done something stupid. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I've killed 2 people. At the time, he thought both the people were dead.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, what do you mean you killed 2 people? And it really shocked me. My wife said, all the color drained out of my face and everything. And I said, George, you did what? He said, well, you'll see it on the news shortly. He said, if you're watching the news, he said, it'll definitely be on the news. He says, I killed him up at Dell Reservoir.
George asked Tom to meet him near the south end of the Salt Lake Valley. He gave an address about 16 miles south of George's apartment, just off the freeway. Tom told George he couldn't meet him until 9 a.m. because he had company.
And he says, I think your phone is being tapped. He said, so I'm going to hang up now. And he just hung up.
After George hung up, Tom called police. At this point, detectives were spread out, working many different leads in the case. Some were still up at Little Dell, some waited at his apartment, while others talked with his sister. Dispatch put out the word that Tom had talked to George.
10-4, I've received a phone call from a potential witness that the suspect has called and talked to, and I need to give that information to somebody right away.
At this point, dispatchers alerted all law enforcement agencies in the valley who they were looking for and what they thought he was driving.
Suspect vehicle, black Bronco, unknown plate. Suspect is a George Benvenuto, male white, 19 years of age, 5'11", 140, brown and brown, brake.
An hour later, at 1:10 a.m., officers found the abandoned Bronco in the parking lot of a car dealership, in the area where George asked Tom to meet him. An officer felt the hood of the vehicle and realized it was still warm, indicating it hadn't been parked very long. K-9 units were sent to the area where they tried to track down George. But they found nothing. The next day at 9 a.m., police went to the location where Tom had told George they'd meet. They waited an hour. No one showed up. About 10 p.m. that night, August 29th, George called Tom again. He told him that he'd walked to a gas station in American Fork, a city another 16 miles south from where the Bronco was found, and that he needed money. Meanwhile, someone called police to report a suspicious person outside the gas station, and local police responded to question the man. Once they learned who he was, they notified Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. It was Keith's boss, Sergeant Jerry Townsend, who drove to the police station, where he found a thin young man wearing shorts, his legs covered in dust from his long walk. Townsend put George Benvenuto in handcuffs and led him to an unmarked police car. After the break, the police questioned George. From the passenger seat of Townsend's unmarked police car, George asked, "How long did it take you guys to find the people I shot?" The sergeant, who passed away in 2018, detailed the conversation they had during the 30-minute car ride in a police report. Townsend said he told George that Yvette had climbed to the road and summoned help almost right away. "You mean the girl isn't dead?" George asked. And when told that she was in the hospital, George responded with shock. "I can't believe she's not dead," he reportedly said. "I wish she would have died so she didn't have to suffer." Then George asked if he thought he'd get the death penalty for what he'd done. George said he wanted to die, and that he'd wanted to die for quite some time, but that he didn't have the guts to do it. Sergeant Townsend took George to an office at the Salt Lake County Justice Center, where Keith Stevens and another detective, Chris Ownby, waited for him. Dressed in a white t-shirt and blue basketball shorts, George sat at a table facing a camera that recorded the 15-minute interview. The shirt is large and hangs on his thin frame, and his hands are cuffed to a chain that encircles his waist. It causes him to lean forward slightly. Behind him is a large, blank whiteboard with erasers. It looks more like a small classroom than a place where one might interrogate a murder suspect. Detective Keith Stevens started by telling him that this would be his only opportunity to speak for himself. George mumbled he didn't care what other people thought. Detective Stevens acknowledged that, but then said he had to read something to him.
I have to read this to you, okay?
It was his Miranda rights.
Let me read it to you. You have the right to remain silent.
He quickly let George know that he had the right to remain silent, that anything he said could be used against him, and that he had the right to an attorney. But almost before Detective Stevens can finish, George started confessing.
What it basically boils down to is I'm tired of living and I don't want to breathe anymore. And
you're tired of living?
Yeah. That's what
Sometimes it's hard to understand what George is saying in this audio, so I'll try to clarify it. In these first few minutes, he repeats that he had never had the desire to kill anybody but himself.
That was in the heat of the moment thing.
Okay. That's just something boiled up inside of you, or?
It's building up. It's been building up for a while.
It has been?
Yeah.
You've had a desire inside?
No, I don't have a desire to kill anybody. I don't have a desire to kill anybody, but...
Tell me what's been going on inside you.
I'm basically just tired of living.
When asked what it is that he'd been feeling that led to him wanting to end his own life, he said, "I'm basically just tired of living."
Okay, when you were up there, were you actually looking for somebody, or did they just come across you and then that's what triggered you to do this?
I wasn't looking for anybody.
"I wasn't looking for anybody," George said.
I was driving around listening to the radio.
Uh-huh.
I was driving around, listening to the radio, seeing if I could muster enough nerve to do me in.
So that was your intention, was to go up there and kill yourself?
Yeah.
And when Detective Stevens asked if murder was a way he could get the state to end his life, he basically said yes.
You figured this would be a mechanism that would help you so you wouldn't have to, or?
In a way. Maybe just too chicken to do it myself.
In a way, maybe I'm just too chicken to do it myself.
Do you remember shooting those two people the other night?
I remember that.
I remember, George said. I stood there and watched and said, "Okay, wait a minute. Can we rewind and do it a little bit differently?" Detective Stevens interrupts him.
You didn't like it the way it turned out? Is that what you're telling me?
I don't know. It's going to sound stupid to say I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to pump 8 rounds.
It's going to sound stupid to say I didn't mean to pump 8 rounds into a couple of kids taking pictures. That's what he tells Detective Stevens.
I really need to do it, but it happened, you know?
And then he adds, I didn't really mean to do it, but it happened, you know? I don't know what came over me.
Did you reload the gun?
I reloaded the gun because, first of all,
this girl must be going through hell, he said. That's why he reloaded, to end her suffering.
Okay. Then did she at one point stop screaming?
She stopped screaming.
And then he tells Detective Stevens he doesn't want to spend his life behind bars. He wants the death penalty.
Give the death penalty.
I deserve it.
George repeatedly asked for the death penalty.
You both know I deserve it.
I deserve it, he said. He looked at the two detectives in the room. You both know I deserve it.
Oh, it's really so bad. I had to do it over again.
If I had it to do over again, I wouldn't do it like that, George said.
Leave them alone. Let them live their life.
I'd leave them alone. Let them live their life.
You just take mine.
And just take mine. Detective Stevens got his confession, but he didn't get any satisfying answers as to why George shot two strangers instead of himself. When Sergeant Jim Potter, the spokesman for the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office, addressed reporters the day after the arrest, he didn't share any of the details from the police interview.
He says he was there. He says that he did this, and he's shown no remorse for that.
The public, including the Snars and Yvette and her family, would never see or hear that interview where George made his confession. Police rarely share recordings of interviews with anyone outside the investigation except prosecutors and defense attorneys. But that meant they never got to judge his explanation for themselves. And because he never spoke to the media or in court, they never heard from George about why he was wandering in the mountains with a gun. Within a week of his arrest, George was assigned a team from the Salt Lake County Legal Defender's Office to represent him in court. On that team was Mark Moffett, then a young lawyer. In 1996, Mark represented people who couldn't afford to hire an attorney on their own. Now, he's a founding member of his own law firm in a one-story building on a busy street in the northwest end of Salt Lake City. After more than 2 decades of defense work, representing hundreds of people, Jorge Benvenuto's case is one that stuck with him. What stands out to him, all these years later, is how much he didn't know about George.
Let me just tell you this. I mean, the passage of time can erode memories, and the one thing I remember is how little we knew.
Mark knew that his client was born in Uruguay, ruled by a repressive authoritarian regime at the time. He had moved to New York when he was 8 with his mother, escaping some sort of domestic violence situation. But when Mark tried to talk to George in jail, he shared very little information.
At the time that we represented George, he was very, very young, incredibly depressed, incredibly suspicious. I'm not sure he trusted us. He was freaked out in a system that he didn't know, in a system he didn't trust, in a place that was not his own. He was in very, very many ways lost.
Mark didn't know the details of George's life, but even as an overworked public defender, he could tell the story that had taken shape in the public eye, that he was a cold-blooded killer who just wanted to watch someone die. That didn't square with the distraught young man that he'd been assigned to represent.
People were saying that this was just Mr. Benvenuto going up to get the thrill of killing somebody. That was never true.
The family didn't share a lot of details with George's attorneys, but clearly there was some deeply rooted trauma, and it extended all the way back to the earliest years of his childhood. A psychological evaluation confirmed that George was depressed and suicidal, not just at the time of the shooting, but for much of his adolescence. He felt isolated, angry, like an outcast.
When you look at what he then did when he went up into the mountains, his description of that is kind of chilling in many ways. He went there with the intent to kill himself and couldn't do it. He tried to take his life. He had the gun in his mouth. He held the gun to his head as he sort of walked around in this trail system up around the top of Immigration Canyon. And then Yvette and Zachary had the misfortune of encountering him while he was in this horrific state where he's suicidal, he's angry at himself, he's angry at the world, he's been attempting to take his own life, and then he lashes out in this horrific sort of way. this was not a situation where he was going up to use his gun to see what it was like to kill somebody. He had his gun with him because he was going to kill himself.
Instead, he killed a young man he'd never met, and he nearly killed a young woman who now faced a long, painful road to recovery. Mark still had many questions about his client and what led up to this terrible crime, a mystery that he would attempt to unpack years later. But back then, George was unwilling or unable to provide answers or insight. While Mark didn't believe it was a thrill kill, that was the way police, the public, and the victims' families made sense of it. And even if people agreed with Mark's view, would it change anything? For a family who'd lost a son and a wounded woman whose life was forever altered by trauma, did it really matter why? Many people thought George deserved the death penalty for his crimes, and George was one of them. Mark and the defense team found themselves in a fight their client didn't really want to win. Next time on The Letter.
Kill him. I actually said that because I thought he deserves to die. I wanted him to die.
In this episode, we learned that George wanted to end his own life before he decided to turn the gun on others. I'm producer Andrea Smardon, and for this week's bonus episode, Amy talks to a psychologist and professor about the nuances of suicidal thoughts and behavior. They explore the links between homicide and suicide, and why many of those who commit murder are also suicidal. You can get all the bonus content by subscribing to Lemonada Premium. You can subscribe right now in the Apple Podcast app by clicking on our podcast logo, and then click the subscribe button.
The Letter is researched and reported by me, Amy Donaldson. It's written by myself and Andrea Smardon, who is also responsible for production and sound design. Mixing by Trent.
Special thanks to Nina Earnest, Becky Bruce, KellieAnn Halvorsen, Ryan Meeks, Josh Tilton, Ben Kuebrich, and Dave Cawley.
Main musical score composed by Allison Leyton Brown.
With KSL Podcast executive producer Sheryl Worsley. For Lemonada Media, executive producers Jessica Cordova Kramer and Stephanie Wittels Wachs. And executive producers Paul Anderson and Nick Panella with WorkHouse Media.
If you like our show, please give us a rating and a review. It helps people find us. Follow us at theletterpodcast.com and on social @theletterpodcast. The Letter is produced by KSL Podcasts and Lemonada Media in association with WorkHouse Media.